What would you do if everything you owned could fit inside a canvas sack and the only person who ever believed in you had just been buried in the frozen ground? What if the last thing she left you wasn't money, wasn't land, wasn't a letter of introduction to anyone who mattered, but a single iron tool, worn smooth from 40 years of use, and a name? Not your own name, the name of a place everyone in the valley had already decided was beyond saving. Pull up a chair and settle in close, because tonight we're telling you the story of Nessa Holt and the old tannery no one wanted on the cold bend of the Greywing River. Nessa Holt was 22 years old the winter her apprenticeship ended in the worst possible way. Her teacher, a leather worker named Odette Vrain, had taken her in at 14, a skinny girl with blistered hands and no last name anyone could verify, found sleeping in the hayloft above Odette's workshop in the river town of Coppervale, somewhere in the hard country north of Lake Superior. Odette had not been a warm woman. She had not been given to speeches or affection or any of the softer things. What she had been was precise, exacting, a craftsperson of the old kind, who believed that if your stitches were uneven, your character probably was too. For 8 years, Nessa learned. She learned to read the grain of a hide the way another woman might read a face. She learned which bark tannins drew the color deep and which left it sitting on the surface like a lie. She learned to cut along the lines of tension, not against them, so the finished piece would hold its shape through decades of hard use. And she learned to do all of this in near silence, because Odette's workshop was a place where the work spoke and the workers mostly didn't. Then, in late November, Odette Vrain died. Quietly, in her sleep, which was the only quiet thing about losing her. She left the workshop to a nephew in Halifax who had never once visited and who sold it within the week to a dry goods merchant who had no use for tanning vats or the girl who knew how to run them. Nessa was given 3 days to clear her things. She left with her canvas sack, a change of clothes, a small tin of tools she'd made herself over the years, and Odette's swivel knife, a beautiful old thing with a handle of elk antler, gone dark with age and use, the blade reground so many times it had taken on a slightly unusual curve that suited Nessa's grip exactly. Odette had used that knife for 40 years. She had not mentioned it in her will because she had assumed, Nessa liked to think, that it simply went without saying. The road out of Coppervale in December is not a welcoming thing. The wind comes off the lake in long flat sheets, and the ground freezes so hard your boot heels ring against it. Nessa walked with her collar up and her head down, the canvas sack over one shoulder, Odette's knife wrapped in cloth inside her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs where she could feel the weight of it. She had $11.40. She had no family. She had no plan beyond a single thing Odette had mentioned once, years ago, in passing, the way a person mentions something they assume you'll never need. "There's a tannery down on the Greywing," Odette had said, not looking up from her work. "Old Forsyth place. Been closed 20 years at least. Good stone building. Good water source. If I were starting over and had nothing, that's the kind of thing I'd look at." She had not said it as advice. She had said it as fact, the way she said most things. Nessa had filed it away and forgotten it, or thought she had. She remembered it now. The town nearest the Greywing Tannery was called Harrow's Crossing, a settlement of maybe 400 people clustered around a mill, a general store, a church with a warped steeple, and an inn that smelled strongly of wet wool. Nessa arrived on the back of a neighbor's sleigh after walking most of the previous day, and the first thing she did was ask the innkeeper about the Forsyth place. The innkeeper, a wide man named Percy Galt, looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup with the specific expression people reserve for strangers who have just said something that confirms their suspicions. "Forsyth Tannery," he said. "On the lower bend. Yes, you're asking about that. I am." He set the cup down. "It's been sitting empty since before my youngest was born. The roof's compromised. The vats are cracked. The drainage is silted up." He paused to let that settle. "The county's been trying to get rid of it for 12 years. Nobody wants the liability. Is there a deed? There's always a deed." He looked at her again, the canvas sack, the worn coat, the particular stillness of someone who has been cold for a long time and learned not to show it. "What are you, a tanner?" "I was apprenticed to Odette Vrain, in Coppervale." Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly, more like recalibration. "Old Vrain's girl." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tax deeds held at the municipal office. Fellow named Archibald Dorr runs it. He's in Tuesdays and Thursdays." He picked his cup back up. "I'll tell you what I told the last 2 people who asked. The water table there is fine. The stone structure is probably sound. Forsyth men built things to last. But that stretch of river has a reputation. Fluting in spring. Ice dams. There's a reason the tanners in this county all moved uphill. Nessa thanked him. She ate the cheapest supper on the menu and slept in the cheapest room and lay awake listening to the wind off the Greywing, which was a different sound than the wind off Lake Superior. Lower, more patient, like something that had been waiting a long time and wasn't bothered about waiting a little longer. She had $9.20 by morning. Archibald Dorr was a small, precise man who wore his reading glasses on a cord around his neck and had the mild, slightly distracted air of someone accustomed to dealing with documents rather than people. He was not unkind. He pulled the Forsyth file without complaint and laid it open on the counter between them with the efficiency of a man who had learned not to editorialize. Lot 9, Lower Greywing Bend, he read. Stone Tannery Building. Main structure approximately 18 by 30 feet. Secondary shed. Stone drainage channel. Water rights to the Greywing tributary as surveyed 1869. Tax arrears accumulated over. He ran his finger down the page. 23 years. Current settlement value, including arrears and transfer costs, $65. Nessa had $9. She told him so. He looked at her over his reading glasses. Then you can't buy it. Not today, she said. Is there a work arrangement? A lease? With option? Archibald Dorr blinked. This was, his expression suggested, not a question he received regularly. He looked back at the file. He turned several pages. He read something, then reread it. Then he said slowly, there is a provision for municipal properties in extended tax arrears, an occupancy agreement. The occupant takes responsibility for the property, makes documented improvements, pays a nominal monthly fee of $2, and at the end of 24 months, if the improvements are assessed as meeting standard, the deed transfers. $2 a month, 24 months. Nessa did the arithmetic quickly. It would leave her almost nothing. She would need to generate income from the property itself within weeks. She said, I'll take it. And that was how Nessa Holt came to be the new occupant of the Forsyth Tannery, a crumbling building on a flood-prone river bend, with no customers, no material, no money to speak of, and a knife in her pocket that had once belonged to the only person who had ever believed she could do anything at all. Word travels in a small town the way cold gets into a poorly chinked wall. Not all at once, and not always where you expect it, but eventually everywhere. By the end of that first week, Harrow's Crossing knew that the young woman from Coppervale had taken the Forsyth place, and the town's reaction was a fairly uniform mixture of pity and bewilderment, with a small side of scorn from the people who felt it was warranted. The general store was owned by a man named Roland Quist, a tall, well-dressed figure with the sort of confidence that comes from having been the biggest merchant in a small town for long enough to confuse his own opinions with general truth. He held court most mornings near the stove, and when the topic of the tannery came up, which it did, because Nessa had gone in to buy nails and oakum, and he had recognized the name Forsyth on her supply account, he had opinions ready. Forsyth Tannery, he said, to no one and everyone simultaneously. Know what killed that operation? The river. Spring melt comes in, you lose your working season. Happened to old Forsyth every other year, till he gave up. He looked at Nessa directly. You're a tanner? I am, by yourself. At present. On the lower bend. He shook his head, not cruelly, just with the settled certainty of a man explaining gravity. You'll find out what everyone else found out. That stretch of river is a losing proposition. The floodwater comes in under the building, sits in the vats, ruins everything you've processed. You can ask anyone who remembers the Forsyths. It was a good operation killed by bad geography. There were a few nods from the other men by the stove. A woman behind the dry goods counter caught Nessa's eye for just a moment, a look of faint apology that said, he's not wrong, but I'm sorry he's saying it that way. Nessa paid for her nails and her oakum and left. The cold hit her in the face like a flat hand. What Quist had said wasn't wrong. She'd seen the watermarks on the tannery's interior walls the first time she'd walked through, clear horizontal lines at ankle height, some of them, and one alarming streak near the main vat bank that ran nearly to her knee. 23 years of spring floods, each one leaving its record in the stone. The building smelled of it even now, in December. That particular mineral damp of water that had claimed a space repeatedly and knew it could come back. She had stood in the middle of the tannery that first morning and taken it all in. The collapsed section of roof at the north end timbers down across the old sorting table. The cracked vats. 3 of the 8 split along their seams, probably from freeze-thaw cycles over decades. The drainage channel choked with silt and debris. The hides rack along the east wall, twisted and rotted. And through the broken north window, the river, gray-green and muscular, moving with that quiet authority of water that has been moving in the same place for a very long time. It was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared. The main structure was stone, and Quist was right about one thing. The Forsyth men had built it to last. The walls were solid, the mortar in good repair where the water hadn't got at the base. The floor was flagstone, mostly level. The fireboxes under the main vats were intact. If she could address the roof and the drainage, she had something to work with. She started on the roof the first morning and did not stop until the light failed. She was not a carpenter, but she had watched buildings repaired and had good mechanical sense and no choice in the matter. She pulled the collapsed timbers out one by one, stacking them for firewood, and spent the first week patching the worst of the gap with what she could afford. Pine boards, tar paper, and a prayer about the weather holding. Her hands, already calloused from years of leather work, split in the cold and bled into her gloves. She kept working. The drainage channel was the next thing. 3 days of digging with a spade in half-frozen ground, her breath coming in white clouds, Odette's voice in her head, saying the thing she said every time a task seemed impossible. Well, it's not going to do itself. At the end of the first week, the roof held. At the end of the second, the drainage ran clear. She lit the firebox under vat number 1 and discovered the flue was sound, which felt at that point like extraordinary good fortune. She made herself a cup of tea on the heat of it and sat on the flagstone floor and felt for the first time that she was not entirely mad. She kept the swivel knife on the workbench. Not because she used it every day. The work she was doing in those first weeks was structural, nothing to do with leather yet, but because she needed to see it. It steadied her. Odette had spent 40 years building something from a bench and a knife and a specific kind of attention to what was in front of her. The knife was a reminder that the standard existed, that it was reachable, that someone had reached it. The town's assessment remained politely skeptical. Percy Galt at the inn was civil when she came in for supplies. The woman at the dry goods counter, whose name turned out to be Mabel Gervais, was quietly kind, setting aside the offcuts of heavy linen Nessa needed for polishing and mentioning, once, that her husband needed harness repair done if Nessa was taking work. Roland Quist did not change his opinion, but also did not repeat it to her face, which was the most she could ask. Then, in February, she found the floor. She had been meaning to pull up the flagstones in the section near the secondary shed and relay them. 2 of them had heaved from frost and sat at angles that caught the toe and were a hazard. She pried them up on a Tuesday morning, and beneath the second stone, instead of the compacted earth she expected, her pry bar went into a gap and came back up against wood. A wooden frame, fitted boards, tongue and groove, still solid. She cleared the loose dirt with her hands and found a latch. The space beneath was a shallow cellar, roughly 6 feet by 8, the ceiling barely tall enough to stand in if you stooped. It was dry, properly dry, which was remarkable given the building's history with water, and she understood immediately why. The cellar was lined on all 4 walls with the same dense local limestone as the building itself. Mortared so finely it was nearly impermeable, and the floor was a thick pour of lime concrete, smooth as a hearthstone. Someone had built this to be waterproof. Someone had thought about it very carefully and had not told anyone it was here. Inside were 4 wooden crates, old but intact. The wood had dried and hardened in the sealed space. She carried them up into the tannery light one by one. The first crate held tools, specialist tools she had heard of but never seen outside of reference books. Leather-working tools of a quality and specificity that made her set them down slowly. One by one, the way you set down something breakable. A multi-pronged stitching chisel with steel teeth at a spacing she couldn't identify. 2 edge bevelers in sizes outside standard range. A bone folder of unusual length. A paring knife with a blade profile she'd never encountered, unlike anything in Odette's kit, unlike anything in her own. And a small hand press, the kind used for embossing, with a set of brass dies wrapped in velvet. She opened one die and turned it in the light and saw a pattern of interlocking circles, intricate, formal, beautiful. The second crate held materials. Rolls of prepared gut thread in gauges too fine for commercial production. Sheets of pressed beeswax with pressed botanical matter trapped inside. Lavender, cedar, she could smell them when she broke a corner, used as preservative dressing. Small sealed tins she opened carefully. Dyes. Not the common ironbark or sumac she'd trained with, but complex preparations in unusual shades. A green with a gray undertone. A rust red that had the warmth of something organic. A deep blue-black that smelled of iron and something she couldn't name. The third crate held notebooks. 7 of them, bound in soft leather that had been kept supple by the cellar's sealed air. On the cover of the first, in careful copperplate, H. Forsyth. Techniques. 1871. Hugh Forsyth. Not the Forsyth men who had built the tannery, but their predecessor, the first one, the one the family had rarely spoken of. She'd heard the name once, from Archibald Dorr, mentioned in passing as the one who started it all. A man described, with slight discomfort, as having ideas above his station. She opened the first notebook and sat down on a crate and forgot entirely that she was cold. Hugh Forsyth had not just been a tanner. He had been, she understood within the first 10 pages, an artisan, in the old sense of that word. A man who had studied the leather traditions of Scotland, where his father was from, and France, where his mother had taken him as a boy, and had come to this stretch of Canadian river with the specific intention of doing something that had not been done in this country. He wasn't making harness leather or sole leather, or the rough utilitarian hides the local market wanted. He had been making fine goods, book covers, gloves of a quality that belonged in a city shop, small boxes and cases, fitted with the embossed dies she'd found in the first crate, sold to people who knew what they were looking at. He had failed, not because his work was poor. She could see from his notes that his work was extraordinary. He had failed because the market for extraordinary things in Harrow's Crossing, in 1871, was approximately zero, and because the Greywing River flooded every spring and took his working season with it. He had sealed his tools and his notebooks in that cellar, with the careful attention of a man who didn't entirely believe the work was finished, only interrupted, and then he had gone. Where? She didn't know. The notebooks didn't say. She read through the night. By morning, she understood 3 things. First, the flooding problem Hugh Forsyth had not solved. She could see how to solve, because Archibald Dorr's file had mentioned a surveyor's note from 1902 about a small retaining berm on the upstream property. The berm was still there. She'd seen it without knowing what it was, and if it were extended and properly banked, it would redirect the worst of the spring melt before it reached the tannery at all. Second, the specialist dyes in the tin were preparations she could identify from Forsyth's notes and, with some work, replicate. Third, there were buyers for fine leather goods in Canada in 1903, more than there had been in 1871, and she was now in possession of techniques and tools that, as far as she could determine, no one else in this country was currently using. She carried Odette's swivel knife to the workbench and set it next to Hugh Forsyth's paring knife with its unusual blade profile, and she looked at the two of them side by side for a long time. Then she made herself breakfast and went to work. The transformation was not quick, and it was not graceful. It happened the way most real things happen, in cold mornings and aching evenings and small, accumulating victories that only you know about. She repaired the vats. She built the extension of the retaining berm herself with the help of a wheelbarrow and approximately 1,000 hours of digging and banking, which was an exaggeration, but did not feel like one. She replicated the first of Forsyth's dye preparations after 3 failed attempts and 1 partial success. And when she finally got it right, the gray-green, which turned out to require a specific ratio of copper mordant she'd been getting slightly wrong. She stood over the dye bath and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Pride. Not the frantic, defensive kind she'd been running on since Odette died. The quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing you've done a difficult thing correctly. Mabel Gervais' husband, Thomas, brought in his harness in March. Nessa repaired it with her own materials and a technique from Forsyth's notebook for the edge finishing that would add years to its life. Thomas Gervais came to collect it and stood holding it in both hands, turning it over. "I've had harness repaired before," he said. He said it carefully, like a man who didn't want to overstate. "This isn't that." Word of the harness reached Percy Galt, who sent his good Sunday bridle. Word of the bridle reached a man named Fletcher Dodd at the sawmill, who brought in a saddle that had been his father's, and that he'd been reluctant to take anywhere for sentimental reasons. Nessa repaired it using Forsyth's edge bevelers, which produced a bevel angle she had never achieved before, and which, she thought privately, Odette would have approved of. Fletcher Dodd looked at the saddle when he collected it and was quiet for a moment. "My father worked 40 years in that saddle," he said. "I thought it was done." "It has another 40 in it," she said, and she meant it. By April, she had enough income to buy materials and keep herself fed and pay the $2 to Archibald Dorr, with something left besides. By May, when the spring melt came and the Greywing ran high and fast and brown along its banks, the berm held. The water rose on the upstream side and found nowhere to go and subsided. The tannery floor stayed dry. She stood in the doorway the morning after the worst of it and watched the river settle and felt the particular quality of satisfaction that comes from having correctly diagnosed a problem. and solved it without assistance. Roland Quist came by in June. He came on a Thursday, which was not incidental. She understood later that he had chosen a time when he was unlikely to encounter other customers, which told her something about how he felt about the visit. He stood in the doorway of the tannery and looked at what it had become. The vats running, the drying frames hung with prepared hides, the workbench organized and lit, the tools laid out with the care she'd learned from Odette and refined from Forsyth's notebooks. He looked at it for a while, then he looked at her. The flooding, he said. Managed, she said. The upstream berm. He nodded slowly. People are saying you do good work. I try to. He was quiet again. Then, my wife has a traveling case, old thing, been in her family. The stitching on the handle mount's going and she won't let me throw it out because of whose it was. He paused. She wondered if you could look at it. Nessa set down the skiver she'd been holding. Tell her to bring it in, she said. I'll take care of it. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. He didn't quite turn around. I may have spoken too quickly, he said, in January, about the proposition being a losing one. She didn't say anything. She let the silence sit. He filled it himself. That's all, he said and left. She went back to work. Outside, the river moved along its banks in the June sunshine, mild now, no threat in it at all. The summer opened things up. Dr. Lenore Atchison, the physician who served Harrow's Crossing and the outlying farms, came by on an afternoon in July. She was a practical, direct woman who wore her hair short and had the particular economy of motion of someone perpetually short on time. She had heard about Nessa from Thomas Gervais and from Fletcher Dodd and from Mabel Gervais, who spoke of her the way people speak of someone they feel they discovered first. She had also, she said, been curious about the Forsyth tannery for years. Why curious? Nessa asked. My father was a surgeon, Dr. Atchison said. He had a medical bag that came through Forsyth's workshop before the place closed. He always said it was the finest leather he'd ever handled. Showed it to me when I was small. She looked around the tannery with a professional eye. I've always wondered what they were doing here that other tanners weren't. Nessa showed her the notebooks. Dr. Atchison sat at the rough table for an hour, turning pages, reading with the focused attention of someone used to understanding technical documents. Occasionally she asked a question. Mostly she was silent. When she finally set the last notebook down, she looked up. This is remarkable work, she said. Hugh Forsyth. I'd heard the name mentioned once or twice as a sort of eccentric. The family didn't talk about him much. She paused. You understand what you have here? I'm beginning to, Nessa said. Have you made anything from his designs, beyond repairs? Nessa went to the shelf on the east wall and brought out the two pieces she'd been building for herself, partly as practice, partly because she'd needed to see if it could be done. A card case, small, in the gray-green dyed leather, embossed with the interlocking circle pattern from the brass die, and a document roll, cylindrical. The leather cut on the bias for flexibility, the seams stitched with the fine gut thread at the spacing of the multi-pronged chisel, edges beveled and burnished to a finish that didn't look like leather so much as it looked like something older and more permanent. Dr. Atchison picked up the document roll. She turned it over in her hands, and she had the same expression Thomas Gervais had had over the harness, the same expression Fletcher Dodd had had over his father's saddle, the look of someone encountering a quality they hadn't expected to find in this place. I need a new medical bag, she said. Mine is adequate. I want one that isn't adequate. She set the document roll down. I want one that someone will still be using in 50 years. Nessa made the bag over the following 6 weeks. It was the most demanding thing she had done since she'd arrived at the Forsyth tannery. A structural project, not just repairs, requiring her to adapt Forsyth's embossing technique for a larger surface area, to engineer the internal frame so the bag would hold its shape empty, to select a hide with exactly the right combination of suppleness and durability. She worked slowly, checking Forsyth's notes and her own instincts against each other at every stage. Odette's swivel knife for the fine cuts, Forsyth's paring knife for the long pulls, the two of them, between them, for everything else. When Dr. Atchison came to collect it, she held it for a long time without speaking. I'm going to tell you something, she finally said. I've purchased things in Toronto. I've ordered things from England. This is better. She looked at Nessa directly. I don't think you should limit yourself to Harrow's Crossing. I'm not, Nessa said. I've been writing to shops in Winnipeg. Dr. Atchison smiled, a rare, quick expression on a face that generally kept its own counsel. Good. Autumn came in with a long, warm September and a sharp October, and the gray wing ran low and clear and lit gold in the afternoons. The tannery had settled into itself, which is to say that Nessa had settled into it. She knew every quirk of the vats, the exact angle of the south window light that told her what a hide surface would look like in natural wear, the particular sound the main fireplace made when the draw was right. It had been less than a year, and it already felt like something that had always been hers. She'd written to 4 shops in Winnipeg and to a department store in Toronto, whose buyer had a reputation for sourcing unusual Canadian goods. She had sent photographs and samples. 2 of the Winnipeg shops had written back with interest. The Toronto buyer had asked for a meeting. She was building a crate for shipping samples on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard footsteps at the doorway and looked up to find Roland Quist's wife, Vera Quist, a quiet, clear-eyed woman she'd seen at church but not spoken to, carrying a battered traveling case in both arms. "Roland told me to come see you," she said. "He said you'd look after it." She set the case on the workbench. It was old, clearly beloved, the leather dried and the handle mount coming away, the stitching on one end split nearly through. On the inside of the lid, in faded ink, a name that wasn't Quist, the name of who it had first belonged to. "My mother's," Vera Quist said. "She carried it across from England in 1878. Nessa ran her hands over the leather. It was, she could feel immediately, an older type of preparation, tighter grain, stiffer, the kind of thing that lasts a century if you looked after it. The damage was repairable. Better than repairable. "I can fix this," she said. "I can also condition the leather. There's a preparation I've been working from that will help the grain stay flexible. It should hold another generation at least." Vera Quist looked at her steadily. "Shall I tell you what Roland said when he came home after his visit here?" "You don't have to. He said he'd been wrong about you." She said it simply, without emphasis. The way people state things they feel ought to be on the record. "He doesn't say that very often. I thought you should know." Nessa thanked her and said she'd have the case ready in a week. After Vera Quist left, Nessa stood alone in the tannery for a moment. Outside, the Grey Wing moved in its late autumn way, deliberate and quiet, drawing down toward the long still of winter. She could hear it from the workbench, a sound she'd come to associate with work and solitude and the slow accumulation of a thing being built. She picked up Odette's swivel knife. She ran her thumb along the line of the blade, not quite touching the edge. It was still sharp. She kept it that way. Odette had not told her what to do with herself after Coppervale. She had not told her where to go, or how to begin, or that any of it would work out. She had only taught her to do the work correctly, and let the work be what it was. The knife was what remained of that. The knife, and the standard it implied, and the knowledge that a standard reached once could be reached again. The following spring, when the Winnipeg buyer arrived on the Thursday coach and spent 2 hours in the tannery looking at finished pieces and asking the sort of specific, technical questions that meant she actually knew what she was looking at. Harrow's Crossing found out about it, the way towns find out about things, gradually, and then all at once. Nessa took the order, which was the largest order she had ever received and the largest the Forsyth tannery had seen in any generation, and spent 3 days calculating materials and timelines and what she would need to hire help. She put a card in Archibald Dorr's window and in the window of the general store. "Leather worker sought, willing to learn, apply to the Forsyth tannery, Lower Grey Wing Bend." Roland Quist walked by it 3 times before he mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to Mabel Gervais, who mentioned it to Fletcher Dodd, who said to his wife that evening that if he'd been 30 years younger and built differently, he'd have applied himself. 2 young women from the farms north of town came on Monday morning. Nessa interviewed them at the workbench, Hugh Forsyth's notebooks open between them, and explained what she did, and what she needed, and what she could teach. She hired them both. One morning that May, she walked out to the edge of the retaining berm and looked down at the Grey Wing, which was running with snowmelt, high and fast, and the particular color of pewter that it turned in spring. The berm was holding. The water rose and found its limit and moved on. Behind her, the sound of the tannery, the apprentices at the vats, the fireboxes running, the creak of the drying frames in the wind. The valley had called this place a failing proposition. They had called it bad geography, flood-prone, beyond recovery. And they had been looking at the right land and the right building and drawing entirely the wrong conclusion, because none of them had stood still long enough to understand what the problem actually was, or had thought it worth their time to solve it. She had stood still. She had listened. She had found what was already here and given it somewhere to continue. The knife was in her pocket. It was always in her pocket. She looked at the river for a while longer, and then she went back inside to work. We'll leave Nessa there, on the bank of the Grey Wing, with the sound of the tannery behind her and everything still ahead. Her story is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the quality of the finished thing, the seam that holds, the edge that doesn't fray. The kind of story that takes years to become visible and then is somehow obvious. We're glad you stayed with us for it tonight. If Nessa's story stayed with you, leave us a comment. Where are you watching from this evening? And tell us, is there something in your own life that others have written off that you know still has something left in it? We'd love to hear. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and we'll see you at the next fire.